This prince was born to continue his father's strength, but he never became the king his father had imagined. Edward II grew up in the shadow of Edward I, a ruler of war, discipline, and command. A man who looked every inch the medieval king. Beside a father like that, almost any son would have seemed smaller. But Edward's problem was not simply that he was different. It was that he was growing up in a world that had no patience for softness, hesitation, or misplaced loyalty. England did not want a gentle prince. It wanted another Edward I, and that was never going to happen. Edward was born on April the 25th, 1284, at Caernarfon Castle in North Wales, while his father's conquest of Wales was still reshaping the land around them. Even his birth carried the atmosphere of force and control. He was not born into a quiet court untouched by war. He was born in a fortress, in the long shadow of a king who had built his reputation through authority and conquest. And that shadow mattered. Edward I was the kind of father who could dominate a room, a court, and a kingdom. He inspired fear as much as obedience. He was the standard by which strength was measured. So from the very beginning, the younger Edward was growing up against an image almost impossible to match. In a world like that, a prince was not expected to be merely likable. He was expected to look commanding, to feel inevitable, to make men believe he could rule them. Edward, even early on, did not seem naturally shaped in that image. That did not make him monstrous. It made him vulnerable. Because princes could be forgiven for many things. But future kings were not easily forgiven for seeming less than their fathers. And this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. And that pressure did not come only from his father. It came from the world around him. Edward was growing up in a court that understood power in very clear terms. A king was meant to command respect almost instinctively. He was meant to look decisive, martial, and strong. In that kind of world, even the smallest sign of softness could become dangerous, not because softness was evil, but because it invited doubt. And doubt around a future king could be fatal. Edward's birth at Caernarfon in 1284 linked him closely to his father's conquest of Wales, and he would later become the first English prince formally invested as Prince of Wales in 1301. Even that title carried expectation. It was not simply honor. It was a public shaping of identity, a signal that this young prince was meant to embody English power in a land his father had subdued by force. But expectation is not the same as character, and that is where the tension in Edward's story begins to deepen. He was being formed for one role, while his nature seemed to lean in another direction. Not yet in a way the whole kingdom could see, not yet in a way that would shake the throne. But enough that, beside Edward I, the contrast already mattered. One was the image of command. The other was still only a boy, growing under that enormous standard in a world that would give him very little room to be anything else. As he grew older, that difference became harder to ignore. Edward did not seem drawn to the same image of kingship that had defined his father. He was not remembered as a natural warrior. He did not carry that same cold sense of command. Even later, when people looked back on him, they saw a man who often seemed more comfortable with ordinary company and practical activity than with the hard performance of royal power. In another kind of life, that might have made him seem approachable, even human. But a medieval prince was not meant to feel ordinary. He was meant to feel above other men. That was the real danger around Edward from the beginning. Not that he was crueler than his father, Not that he was more violent, but that he seemed less made for the role waiting for him. And in a court shaped by hierarchy, war, and pride, that kind of weakness did not stay private for long. People watched princes carefully. They watched how they carried themselves, what they admired, whom they trusted, what kind of men they seemed to become. And little by little, the question around Edward was no longer simply whether he would inherit power. It was whether he would ever look as though power truly belonged in his hands. For now, though, he was still only a young prince, still growing, still being measured, still living under the immense presence of Edward I. The real crisis had not yet begun, but the fault line was already there. A father built for conquest, a son who seemed shaped for something else, and in the world they lived in, that difference would not remain harmless for long. As Edward moved further into adolescence, the court around him watched more closely. A prince could not hide inside childhood forever. The older he became, the more people began to look for signs of the man and the king he might one day become. And what they saw did not always inspire confidence. Edward did not seem to possess his father's instinct for dominance. He did not project the same force, the same certainty, the same ability to make power look natural. That mattered because medieval kingship was never just about birth. Birth could place a crown within reach, but character determined whether men believed you deserved to wear it. A future king was expected to command loyalty before he ever gave an order. He was expected to look as though authority belonged to him by nature. And Edward, even while still young, seems to have struggled with that image. There was also a deeper problem. The world around him did not merely expect strength. It demanded performance. A prince had to be seen in the right way. He had to admire the right things, trust the right men, move through the court with the kind of confidence that reassured the political world around him. Edward, however, was beginning to seem less predictable than that, less fitted to the role, not openly disastrous, not yet, but different enough for the contrast with his father to sharpen. And that contrast would only grow more dangerous with time. Because a prince who seems unlike his father can still be tolerated. A king who seems unlike the age he rules in is another matter entirely. Edward was growing up toward a role that would leave him very little space for uncertainty and very little mercy for weakness. The expectations around him were not soft. They were waiting. And soon, they would begin to collide with the kind of man he actually was. Soon, that difference found a focus. One man, one attachment, one relationship that would begin to poison everything around him. His name was Piers Gaveston. He was a Gascon knight who had been brought into the royal household and had known Edward from youth. Edward I eventually banished Gaveston in 1307, a sign that the bond between the two young men had already become politically troubling. But when Edward II came to the throne after his father's death in July 1307, one of his first acts was to bring Gaveston back, and not quietly. He raised him fast, too fast. He gave him titles, honors, and influence that shocked the political world around him. In August 1307, Gaveston was made Earl of Cornwall, a dignity many nobles believed far too great for him. The message was impossible to miss. Edward did not merely favor this man. He elevated him above the comfort, pride, and patience of the realm. This is where Edward's private instincts began to become a public disaster. People could debate the exact nature of his attachment to Gaveston. Historians still do. But the political effect was plain. Edward trusted him too much, preferred him too openly, defended him too stubbornly. And in a medieval court, that kind of visible preference was more than unwise. It was humiliating. To the great lords, it looked as if the king had handed his judgment to someone they considered an arrogant outsider. And Gaveston did not help Edward. Contemporary accounts and later chroniclers alike leave the impression of a man whose confidence, ambition, and contempt for others made him easy to resent. The king's attachment made him powerful. His behavior made him hated. Then came Isabella. In January 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip IV. She was very young, beautiful, intelligent, and politically valuable. The marriage should have strengthened the crown. Instead, it became another stage on which Edward's priorities were exposed. Gaveston was not pushed aside. He remained at the center. Even at the wedding and coronation, his prominence caused anger and insult. To Isabella's family, to the English barons, and to everyone watching, the king seemed more absorbed by his favorite than by his queen. What should have looked like a royal union instead looked like the beginning of a scandal. And scandal, in a medieval monarchy, could very quickly become rebellion. The barons did not merely dislike Gaveston, they feared what he represented. If one man could dominate the king so completely, then what did that say about the king himself? Opposition hardened. In 1311, a group of barons known as the Lords Ordainers forced through reforms designed to restrain the crown, and among their demands was Gaveston's exile. Edward submitted, then resisted. Gaveston left, then returned. The whole pattern was already there: pressure, resentment, defiance, and Edward's inability to let go of the one bond that was costing him everything else. In 1312, the crisis finally broke. Gaveston was captured by his enemies and killed. Edward had lost the man he most wanted to protect. But instead of learning caution, he seemed only to deepen the habits that had already brought his reign to the edge. And while all this was happening, the kingdom itself was not standing still. Edward had inherited war with Scotland from his father, but he had inherited it without his father's authority, skill, or fearsome reputation. In 1314 came Bannockburn. It was a crushing English defeat at the hands of Robert the Bruce, and it permanently damaged Edward's standing. Kings were supposed to protect the realm, to command in war, to look as though defeat would bend around them rather than strike them full in the face. Bannockburn told a different story. It told England that its king was not in control, and once that idea takes hold, it is very hard to kill. By now, Edward's reign was beginning to look less like a troubled kingship and more like a pattern of failure. He had alienated powerful nobles. He had humiliated his queen. He had lost Gaveston. He had failed in war. But the most dangerous thing was deeper than any one event. He still did not seem to understand how kingship worked in the world he lived in. He treated loyalty as something personal when the realm needed it to be political. He confused affection with judgment. He kept turning inward, toward favorites and private bonds, while the country demanded force, balance, and command. After Gaveston's death, the space around Edward did not grow calmer. It filled again. This time with the Despensers, Hugh le Despenser the Younger and his father. If Gaveston had been hated, the Despensers would become something worse. They built power through the king: land, patronage, access, fear. Their rise was tied to Edward's need for dependence and to his habit of concentrating favor in ways the political nation found intolerable. Hugh the Younger in particular became central at court, and the resentment against him spread wide and deep. The problem was no longer one favorite. It was a whole style of rule that made the king look captured by the people closest to him. And here, Isabella's story darkens too. She had once been the young French bride pushed aside for a favorite. Now she was queen in a court increasingly dominated by men she hated, and who, in turn, worked to reduce her influence. The marriage had never truly offered her dignity. Now it offered even less safety. Edward and Isabella had children, including the future Edward III, and from a distance that might suggest normality, continuity, even success. But dynastic children do not erase humiliation. They do not erase resentment, and they do not erase the political cost of a king who repeatedly chooses the wrong intimacy at the wrong time. By the 1320s, the monarchy was rotting from within. Opposition hardened again. Thomas of Lancaster had already become one of Edward's great opponents, and after years of disorder, the realm slid into more violence, more revenge, and more bitterness. Edward could still be harsh. He could still punish. He could still lash out. That is part of what makes his story so tragic. He was not too gentle to be cruel. He was too unstable in judgment to be trusted with power. He could be vindictive without being truly strong, and that combination made his rule even more dangerous. Then came the final break. In 1325, Isabella went to France to help settle the dispute over Gascony. She did not return. There, away from Edward and the Despensers, she formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord and enemy of the regime. Their relationship became both political and personal. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England. Support for Edward collapsed with astonishing speed. That speed says everything. A strong king can be opposed. But a king whose authority has already hollowed out can suddenly find that almost no one wishes to save him. The Despensers were captured and executed. Edward fled, failed, and was taken. The king, who had once seemed unable to surrender any favorite, now found himself abandoned by the kingdom he had ruled so badly. In January 1327, Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the future Edward III. It was one of the most humiliating falls any English king had suffered. He had not simply lost power. He had lost the argument that he was fit to hold it. And that is the core of his tragedy. Edward II did not collapse because of one battle, one enemy, or one scandal. He collapsed because too many people had come to believe the same thing, that the crown sat on the wrong man. His attachments had become political poison. His failures had become impossible to excuse, and his weakness, once only a private concern, had become a national danger. He was imprisoned first at Kenilworth, then at Berkeley Castle, and there, in September 1327, he died. For centuries, his death has been surrounded by one of the most notorious stories in English history, the tale of the red-hot poker. But that should not be repeated as fact. Modern historians treat it with deep caution, and the safer conclusion is simpler and darker. Edward was almost certainly killed in captivity, but the exact method remains uncertain. Even in death, then, he was trapped between truth and legend. A fallen king, a scandalous memory, a body around which people built horror because the life itself had already become so catastrophic. And maybe that is why Edward II still fascinates. Not because he was the worst man ever to wear a crown, and not because his story can be reduced to one favorite, one queen, or one lurid ending. He matters because he reveals something cruel about monarchy. A king can be born in a fortress, raised under the image of greatness, marked out for power, and still fail completely at being the thing his age demands. Edward was not his father. England saw that early. The tragedy is that Edward himself never found a way to overcome it. He wanted attachment where the world required command. He offered preference where the realm required balance. And in a century that had no patience for that confusion, the result was always going to be ruin. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.